Alright, let's talk about Path of Exile 2 and the deeper problems and issues with it. First off, this video is mainly for my existing Path of Exile viewers and Twitch audience, and it assumes you are familiar with both games. If you are genuinely enjoying Path of Exile 2 or are simply just freebasing Copium, feel free to move on. I'm going to try to cover as much as I can here, but this is not exhaustive. I have quite a long list, and I'm trying not to have this be a 5-hour video. It's worth saying that none of these criticisms have to do with the difficulty or the supposed tedium, but they have to do with deeper design issues, a lot of which were present in PoE 1 and now seem to be even more present in PoE 2. Those crying it's early access, move on, just don't worry about it, it'll get fixed. First off, things rarely ever greatly change in early access to launch. And from what we've heard from people who were in the closed betas, this has basically been the state of the game for quite some time, and this is very much the vision that GGG sees right now for Path of Exile 2. And this is not just a few. The issues that we're looking at are not just some numbers that need to be tweaked or some minor adjustments here or there, but really are deeper design issues that have to do with the philosophy of how they see the game and what mechanics and design ideas they think are actually healthy for the game. Because right now, it feels like a lot of the bad design from Path of Exile 1 has kind of been distilled and crystallized into another game. A lot of features that weren't very popular or that ultimately didn't wind up getting cut, or just is basically, we're seeing a lot of it in Path of Exile 2. I was definitely a bit of a doomsayer before PoE 2 launched, but even I, severely undershot I did not expect there to be this many issues out the gate, and I did not expect the issues to be this deeply entrenched into the game. I thought that the issues with PoE 2 would be more over time, namely to do with overall poor skill balance over time, unique bloat, etc., etc. That's what I kind of expected, is something relatively alright out the gate, and then to kind of just follow the same road that Path of Exile 1 did over time. Instead, I think we kind of have a bit of a true mess on our hands here. Alright, so before we dive into the whole meat and bones of it, I just want to say the art, the assets, the animations, and the overall general polish level is very high. The artists and environment designers, etc., did an absolutely amazing job. The game looks absolutely incredible. It is definitely the best looking ARPG on the market right now, and it's really nice sometimes just to run around the zones and look at the environments and just see how great they are. And then after picking up your 500th white item to transmute an Augit, you just kind of realize that it's all looks and no substance. So I've got a big list of things we're going to be running through here, but there are three main categories that I want to go over that kind of are the three big things that are wrong with the game, and those are: 1, the friction; number 2, the RNG; and number 3, player agency or lack thereof. So let's talk about friction. So what is friction? Friction, or weight, is just kind of can be more or less equated to being tedium or anti-quality of life, or just having the player have to go through certain, often repetitive or mindless actions just in order to have something not be fully automatic. Having a game with no friction whatsoever tends to lead to everything, essentially feeling like the game plays itself. But GGG is very much committed to the whole high friction ideal, where they think that everything must have weight. There must be a lot of interactions. The player must do a lot of meaningless tasks in order to accomplish something. if friction is a spectrum, if there's a spectrum with high friction on one end and high quality of life on the other end, GGG has always, throughout the past 10 years plus, committed very heavily to that high friction ideal. There have been times they pushed it heavily in PoE 1, and a lot of the times they've had to back down due to the reaction from the player base. So the first example of friction, there's a lot of different examples. Stuff like Wisdom Scroll still existing. The most notable example that people like to talk about is the Wells, which is something that they mentioned, I think at ExileCon or something, is something they thought of as an idea, but they were like, no, we can't do that because the player base will push back on it so hard, because why would you want to go to town, walk, and click over a well to refill your flask as opposed to just them being automatically refilled? It's, it's like one of those meaningless action things that, supposedly adds weight or friction to the game, but really is just an exercise in tedium. But, yeah, lo and behold, we have Wells in PoE 2, and the part, it gets particularly bad when you're in late Act 3, in the time travel part, and you need to go back to refill your flasks, and you need to take your portal back to the time gate, go through the time gate, go click on the well, go back through the time gate, then back to your portal. It gets a little bit ridiculous. It's just one of those things where they're committed to this high friction ideal, even though nobody really seems to enjoy or ask for it. And if it was missing, no one would think about it. Like, if wells weren't a thing, no one would be going, oh yeah, God, I really, really wish I had to make an extra click in town to refill my flasks. But the worst example of this, and I think the thing that highlights it the most, is the way the vendor system currently works in Path of Exile 2. So, in Path of Exile 1, with vendors, we essentially had just two functions, buy and sell. We had one option for buying and one option for selling, and they later added a shortcut to control click to just immediately open the selling window, because that's what you're using 90% of the time, 99% of the time when you're in endgame. If you wanted something else from a vendor besides, the random shards you would get and whatnot from vendoring stuff, there were the vendor recipes, which were definitely a bit, obtuse, unintuitive, and required use of the wiki. It's not something new players would really figure out on their own. But what it did do is it made it so we had just one window where we throw everything in and we get back what we want. I can throw in, a bunch of rare items, a 6 socket, and 3 of the same item, for a 3-to-1 or whatever, and get back exactly what I wanted out of all of those things. I don't have to worry about different vendors or anything like that, provided I didn't accidentally create some vendor recipes I didn't mean to. Now, in Path of Exile 2, we have essentially 4 different vendors. We have one vendor to vendor items for gold, one vendor to vendor items for shards, one vendor to do a 3-to-1, and then one vendor to get artificer orbs for the sockets from items. So when you're picking up items, there are essentially like 4 different categories you have to sort it out into. Now, obviously, you're not doing all of these at once. Like, you're not going to be like, oh, I'm going to pick up these few items in a map to vendor for gold and these for shards. You're either thinking, I'm vendoring all my rares for shards, or I'm vendoring all my rares for gold. Or, and with Artifice Orbs, well, those you kind of do have to sort, because if you're low on Artifice Orbs, yeah, you need to pick those up and put them aside in your inventory so you don't accidentally vendor them, for shards and orbs, etc., etc. But the worst of these, by far the worst offender, is the 3-to-1 bench. And this is absolutely atrocious right now, because, especially when it comes to map vendoring. Because instead of being able to just throw a shitload of maps into the vendor and get them all back at once, you now have to do this crap where you put 3 in, that you then have to click the button reforge. Oh, and don't forget to ID your maps. Then you have to remove the other map. It doesn't get automatically removed if you hit reforge on another one. And you've even got this little shitty animation where once you click it, you know, you have to wait a second for the item to appear. You know, this is the kind of like friction and wait. You know, like, oh, it's kind of like thematic. There's an animation, but this is a game that is designed to be played for hundreds and thousands of hours, and these kinds of little friction things get really, really annoying really, really fast. Like right now, what I wish I could do is just take all my maps and just throw them all in at once and get back all my higher tier maps. Then throw in, the ones that I got back, basically the same way it worked in PoE 1. Instead, we have this. Which is just objectively worse in every way possible. It is a shitload of friction, a shitload of tedium, and it's just really, it's cute the first time you use it, and then once you start having to use it a lot in endgame, you're like, wow, this system is actually really bad. And the thing that drives me crazy is that the solution to this is so easy. I mean, the 3-to-1 bench aside for a moment, like talking back again about the gold versus the shards versus the artificer orbs, instead of picking up items and having to worry about which of one of three ways I plan to dispose of them, it would make much more sense if there was just one vendor that you vendored items for gold only, and then you simply increase the drop rate of regal orbs and, transmute orbs and whatnot slightly to compensate for the fact that you couldn't vendor these items. Now, this would be a bit different than how it worked in PoE 1, because you'd be vending items for gold and not shards, but I think gold is a whole nother story, something I haven't really decided how I feel about yet, but generally it kind of seems like it really is worse than the systems we had in PoE 1, where the shards were essentially everything, and you bought stuff from the vendor for small amounts of minor currency instead of some arbitrary gold amount. So you could instead have a system where, we just vendored everything for shards, and then just had artificer orbs drop at a higher rate, and you could no longer, dismantle stuff for artificer shards. Now, you could argue, okay, this maybe decreases a bit of choice because you can get more artificer orbs, yada yada, if you went to picking them up, but that kind of defeats the entire point here. It kind of, the whole problem is that we now have essentially 4 different vendors instead of one, and 4 different ways to dispose of items instead of one, which is quite annoying, especially when you alter control click, the wrong one, and you're like, oh wait, I didn't mean to vendor for gold, or didn't mean to vendor for shards. It's one of those systems where you've taken a perfectly good and working and functional system that essentially no one ever really complained about in PoE 1, and replaced it with a system that I dare say is objectively inferior in PoE 2. Now, this also ties in a bit to the crafting system regarding friction, because, again, we don't have alteration orbs, so crafting is essentially just either picking up items off the ground, transmuting, and auging and regaling, or picking up rares and trying to just exalt them, or just going to the gambler and, mass buying gloves or something, and then just, essentially doing the same there, repeat, and sinking gold. Essentially, when I'm picking up 100 white gloves, transmuting them, and then dropping them all on the ground, we're essentially doing the same thing that we were doing with alteration orbs. It's just, again, a lot more friction and a lot clunkier. It's not really... It's one of those things that gets really tedious and really annoying after a while, because you're just like, why can't I just pick up alterations, which are more flexible, they're generic, you can use them on whatever item you want. Instead, I'm picking up 100, 200, 300, 500, 1,000 gloves, until I get my glove upgrade. I'm picking it, and then I'm doing the same for boots, legs, etc. Well, not there are no legs, but you know what I fucking mean. Like chests, boots, etc. It's essentially taking a perfectly working system and replacing it with something that is very clunky and is very high friction. And I'll be talking more about the crafting system in a bit, but I'm trying to keep this somewhat organized here. But yeah, so functionally the whole picking stuff out of the ground is the same as alt spamming, but just less flexibility. And one last point I want to make on friction, which is specifically, it's a very specific complaint, but it has to do with the augury map, which is definitely the most annoying map they have right now. When I was mapping an endgame, with the map, the little mapping I did manage to force myself through, augury was the map that I just avoided. Like, I would see augury, I'd be like, nope, find another way. And I eventually got to the point where all of my progress was eventually ringed by auguries, and I was forced to run through them. That goes and ties into the whole player agency and lack of choice. You know, you're no longer really allowed to choose your layouts. You know, in PoE 1, you had you had to run each map once or so. You know, maybe more for the Divine Vessel thing or whatnot. But generally, you could avoid bad layouts if you didn't want, and that's not an option here. But that is more in the agency part, and we'll be coming that to it in a bit. Okay, so the second thing, well, I mean, there's more examples of friction, but as I said, I'm trying not to make this be a 5-hour video. So the second thing I want to cover is how RNG is viewed and implemented in both Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2. So overall, PoE 2 is a very, very RNG game, both with crafting, with mapping, i.e. choosing your next layout, you know, what league mechanics you get to participate in, and what those league mechanics ultimately are. You know, i.e. having a very RNG mechanic such as Ultimatum or Expedition, you know, those are automatic includes in PoE 2. But having mechanics where you maybe had a bit more control, such as like Incursion, you know, that's nowhere to be seen. First off, I want to talk a bit about crafting and the history of crafting in PoE 1, because one thing I see people say, which is horribly misinformed, was that, you know, PoE 1 didn't have a lot of deterministic crafting at the start. You know, PoE 1, you know, like all the stuff that we take for granted today, bench crafting, harvest, delve, you know, fossils, essences, etc., even stuff like annulment orbs and so on. These weren't in the game at the get-go, and this is true. However, what people either aren't aware of or don't remember was that item power in Path of Exile 1 was a much smaller percent of overall player power in early PoE 1 than it is in early PoE 2. And this is very easy to observe just by looking at the items. You know, back in PoE 1, getting something like a +3 staff, you know, +1 all with +2 to a certain element type was essentially, you know, the peak that you could get. You know, if you're lucky, you manage to get a high increased damage roll on top of that. But generally, item power was a lot more restricted. Like, items were still powerful and items still built on your character. And now we have a good example of the game crashing constantly. I had this issue. I still have this issue, actually. It's not something that has gone away. I have the whole X3D crash where the game just crashes like about once every hour. And there's nothing I can do to avoid it. I've tried like all the workarounds, and it still keeps happening. But I digress. Back to the itemization. So in Path of Exile 2, rares are way stronger. And just to use a direct caster to caster comparison, on a staff now in PoE 2, you can get something like, you know, +6 to all spells, 40% cast speed, you know, like 200 increased damage on a staff and whatnot. Like, the numbers are easily double what they were in PoE 1 at the start. Hell, they're almost doubling what they could be in PoE 1 right now. You know, influence mods and whatnot notwithstanding, and the other avenues of scaling that they give. But generally, in PoE 2, the rares are a much larger percent of your player power than they were in early PoE 1. In early PoE 1, you only really cared about, you know, unless you were playing like an elemental attack build like Lightning Arrow or something like that, where you wanted flat Elion rings and weapon elemental damage. Yeah, apparently here it crashed twice. Yeah, it's going great. you generally mainly wanted life, resist, maybe move speed on your gear, like stuff like armor was still pretty shit back in the day. It was mainly just life and resist. We got defenses other ways with stuff like block, mainly from the tree and stuff like that. But there is far, far, far more demand on PoE two items than PoE one. Like when I'm gearing in PoE two, I feel like I need stats because the stats on the tree are relatively shit. Being able to choose your +5 node is great, but the overall amount of stats you get is way less, especially because the 30 offstat nodes are missing. Like in Path of Exile 1, you would, if you were in the int zone, there would be +30 strength and +30 dex nodes to help balance those out. Even in the original starting area, like the witch right between the practice casting or whatever it was, +20 strength and dexterity to help balance your off stats. So even though you can choose your stats now, you need a lot more of them. There's less on the tree. And the gems especially, the requirements are quite high. Like to get a high level gem, something like 200 stats now. And that's, not counting your support gems and whatnot. So there's much, much, much higher demand on the gear. And in terms of the overall potential you can actually, the power potential you can get from it. And a lot more stats that you would consider to be like, more or less mandatory. And that's not even really, not even beginning to talk about something like rarity and how required that is right now with the way they've designed that. I mean, the fact they've included that is a whole nother story, but we'll get to that. So, yeah, so going back to the whole PoE 1 gearing versus PoE 2, rares in PoE 1 used to be a lot weaker, especially at the start, compared to PoE 2. A lot more of your player power was located in the passive tree or in your gem setup, whereas in PoE 2, the passive tree is much, much weaker, and the gem setup is, still a strong part of it. But basically, a bunch of power has shifted out of the passive tree and into the gear. And the passive tree being super anemic and problematic is a big part of this issue. We have a lot of nodes that are just super, super conditional or specific. There's not that many generic nodes compared to PoE 1. There's also a lot of travel time, a lot of dead nodes. Like in PoE 1, every time you pass through just an attribute node, there's always clusters off everyone, even if it's not clusters that are good for you. There are good clusters there that are fit with the thematic area of the tree. In PoE 2, you have a lot of these clusters which don't actually, or these attribute nodes which don't actually attach to any cluster, which leads to a lot more time just traveling and pathing, and therefore a lot less power out of the tree overall. Removing life from the tree is also really problematic in this regard, because it means that with nobody specking into life, everyone is specking in roughly the same amount of damage, so you can't, like, have a softcore build that's a bit more glassy, less HP, more damage, or a hardcore build that's a bit more life and a little less damage, because everyone's kind of balanced around having the same bit of damage now. So essentially, the passive tree is less about specking into damage nodes that will put you further ahead, and more about just preventing you from falling behind. Like, you have to spec in nodes just to not fall too far behind. I think removal of masteries was a huge mistake in this regard. They added a lot of interesting choices to have those super notables where you could pick which one was best fit your build, and going after similar clusters just to get additional masteries also made things a bit more interesting. We don't know if they'll add that at some point, but it's the kind of thing where I think that if they were originally planning on having it, we would have seen some form of it in this version. If they add it later at this point, it's definitely going to be more of a reaction to the criticism of the passive trees rather than their original game design. Yeah, there's lots of really bad nodes, like, there's the node that's minus 5% move speed to give you 1% life regen off stationary, which gets memed about. That is, basically the worst node on the entire tree, but there's lots of others that are, in the same category where they're just either really bad or just way too specific, way too conditional, and it makes it much harder to get damage or nodes that you actually need sometimes. I will note that this seems to vary a lot based on where you are on the tree. Like when I played my ranger, I felt like there were a lot more good nodes down there, at least for a while, rather than compared to when I was playing my witch, where I felt kind of starved looking. Not witch, sorry, sorcerer, where I felt like the good nodes were a lot further between and took a lot more pathing. So there's definitely a bit of a balance issue going there, but the theme is consistent where the tree just in general, no matter where you are, feels a lot more anemic and a lot more insubstantial and a lot less impactful than the PoE 1 tree originally felt. So coming back to the itemization. So the rares in PoE 2 are way stronger. So we're still talking about RNG, or at least trying to talk about RNG here. So going back to the history of PoE 1 for a moment. Every time some kind of deterministic-ish crafting or any kind of anything beyond just the pure RNG base crafting was added in PoE 1, it was always received very widely by the player base as positive. Whether it was bench crafting, essence, delve, harvest, past the first couple weeks when it was absolute garbage. It's generally almost always received as something positive, as we have more control over how we can craft items. We have it's a bit less RNG. But before we dive further into this, I want to talk for a minute about the original sin behind Path of Exile's item design, and this is the original sin behind both PoE 1 and PoE 2. Which can be stated quite simply. The basic system is simply far too random. It's far too random. You have 6 mods per item. You can roll high tier mods, you can roll low tier mods, you can roll mods that are, bad for your build, you can roll mods that are good for your build. There's a lot of mods. And if that's not enough, you have junk mods that are just objectively bad, such light radius, thorns, etc., stuff like that, which basically exist just to make items worse. Now, some people I've seen quite frequently argue that you need the bad mods to make the good mods good, and this is just easily disproven. That this is so false. You can have you can have an item that is still bad for you that rolled good mods simply because those mods don't have synergy with each other, or because those mods aren't good for your build. All having extra bad mods do is further dilute the items and make it so you have to pick up more and more and more items before you find something good. And that's why in PoE 1, people really just generally don't pick up items, past the first couple days, first week at most. You're only really picking up items when you're starting a league and you have no currency, and that's essentially the only way to get the basic gear. And even then, you're only looking for the most basic of basics. Life, resist gear, move speed on boots, that kind of thing. Once you're ready to get gear that takes more, that is more powerful, you're not picking it up off the ground anymore. What you're doing is you are crafting it with currency, with the tools that are available to you in the game. Now, it's worth noting that PoE has one of the most RNG gear systems out of all the ARPGs. To use a couple examples, Last Epic only has 2 prefixes and 2 suffixes and generally tries to avoid the junk mod philosophy. Something like Grim Dawn is just merely 1 prefix, 1 suffix. And I'm not saying that PoE needs to go to that, to reduce the number of mods and items. I'm just trying to highlight that just how incredibly RNG the item system is in both PoE 1 and PoE 2. And this is exactly why these mechanics, the bench crafting, essence, delve, harvest, even conquer, exalts, and stuff like annulments being added in Harbinger. Annulments are essentially RNG, but they can let you remove a potentially bad mod and, let's say, benchcraft a good mod, or you say a conquer, exalt, or some other semi-deterministic method, to turn a bad item into a good one. So you have this system that's incredibly RNG, and GGG has, over the years, periodically added these deterministic systems, and they've almost all been nerfed heavily at some point. Now, granted, when they are introducing League mechanics, they try to go a little more all out and then tone it down, but a lot of these systems have been nerfed, repeatedly, even long after they have been released. Bench crafting and harvest being the two notorious examples of this, but fossils also got nerfed, quite heavily, not merely just after Delve League, but further on. Now, some of these nerfs were probably good. For example, Delve Fossils adding their own specific Delve mods probably wasn't overall good for game design, because it made it, so if you want to craft ES gear, you basically have to use fossils, and there should sort of ideally be more than one way to get an item. Of course, essences kind of subvert this a little, because stuff like deafening essences and whatnot can let you put mods that you normally can't craft, so it's a bit of, sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not, but either way, the whole thing behind all these systems being added is that they reduce the RNG in the crafting system. They let you have a somewhat more deterministic, not like hard deterministic, so there's still RNG, you're not ever guaranteed anything in Path of Exile, but it would reduce the potential RNG were you to acquire these specific methods, were you to go out of your way to farm this content and whatnot. I didn't even remember that one. That one was funny. But in Path of Exile 2, all these systems have been stripped away. There is no bench, there are no fossils, harvest, conquer, results, nothing like that. There is only essence, is the only mechanic that seems to have survived, but essence is very, very, very watered down compared to how it was in PoE 1. We only have two types of essences now, the lesser and the greater, and while that may seem, due to the way, greater essences are essentially regals now, that while that may seem like an improvement on first glance, you realize that because there are no tiers of essences, you can no longer guarantee, a high tier of mod. You can essence something, and it might be a low tier mod, it might be a high tier mod, and then you can you have to go the full RNG on the AUG, and then if you have greater essences, you can essence it again, and it will go, if you're lucky, it'll get a high tier. If you're unlucky, you'll get a low tier, and now you have to find another base. The fact that we don't even have scourings, and you can essentially brick an item on a single transmute, honestly feels kind of absurd. And the whole, picking items up in the map just to transmute AUG, that was something that, you had no problem doing the first couple days of a League in PoE 1, just to further increase your gear flow. But in PoE 2, it seems like, you're probably not going to be picking up magic items or you transmute AUG, but it seems like in endgame, you're basically either picking up white items to just use essence, AUG, essence, or rare items to, just slam if they have good mods, and that's basically it. There's no 20-step processes, which was something I really enjoyed. Was something that came around, toward the end of, with the advent of Harvest, was having these really, really long crafting steps where you had these methodical plans of how to craft a certain item. I really enjoyed that, and now it's just essentially been replaced with a casino. It's just a slot machine lever, and if you have good gear, it's because you either bought it on trade or you pulled the slot machine lever really, really fast, as many times as you could until you got good gear. I was watching Rise over the past couple days try to get a new pair of gloves, And it seemed like almost every time I tuned into a stream, it's just mass buying gloves off the vendor, transmute og regal, vendor everything back, mass buy gloves off the vendor, transmute og regal. It's so brain dead. It's so brain dead, it's so thoughtless, and it's so boring compared to the methods we had before. And this is why I'm saying, like, this is not just an early access thing. This is not like an, oh, they'll add it more. No, they made a very deliberate choice with which mechanics they wanted to include and which mechanics they wanted to leave behind in PoE 1. By looking at which ones they've included, it's very obvious that just about anything with deterministic crafting they have chosen to leave behind, because they think that all these mechanics essentially subvert dropped items off the ground. They want dropped items off the ground to actually mean something. And this is something we also saw in PoE 1, where the new influence system, the Exarch Eater system, was designed as something that could be used to augment existing items with new implicits, as opposed to the old system where the influenced bases essentially replaced the old bases and further invalidated ground drops. They wanted that new system to be, something where people could find something off the ground and then add their Exarch Eater stuff, rather than, 99% of the ground rares being worthless because they weren't influenced. But what they don't really understand is that 99% of the ground drops are worthless, not because of these crafting methods, but again, going back to that original sin of the RNG, the crafting system being way too RNG. And this truth is kind of laid bare in Path of Exile 2 right now, where it's just, just pure fucking RNG and how you craft them. People have been saying, this is all just wisdom scrolls with extra steps, and it's hard to disagree with that assessment. It's essentially what it feels like. You have no real way to modify mods once they're on an item, except, you can Chaos Orb it, and it'll just, one random mod will change. But a Chaos Orb is just an Annul and an Exalt combined together now. And Annul Exalting was literally never a thing in PoE 1, like, ever. Like, at no point is it ever like, oh yes, Annul Exalt now to as the next step in your item. It's just not a thing. So it just underscores, that it's just another just pure RNG thing on top of being more pure RNG. And yes, this is an ARPG. It's a random genre, and, there's supposed to be RNG in it and whatnot. The items are inherently random. But there's kind of a degree to, like, what randomness can actually be tolerated, because, you get to a certain point where you just make everything random, and it no longer feels like you're thinking about anything or planning anything. It literally is just, you're pulling a slot machine lever over and over and over as fast as you can. And I think PoE 2 has gone way past that mark, that slot machine mark, and is essentially, almost a poorly disguised casino masquerading as a video game. This high level of RNG also leads to a hyper emphasis on trade. PoE 1 always had this problem where trading for gear was almost always better than crafting yourself. I'm not a big fan, personally, of trading for gear. I mainly play HC and HCSSF. And when I do play a trade league, I will never ever trade for rares, ever. I will always craft things myself. I will trade for uniques. I will trade for, maybe some really, really, really rare base type that, is unreasonable to farm or something like that. But I literally never buy rares. I will craft everything myself. In PoE 2, because of the high RNG in crafting, it's almost always to buy things by yourself, and you can see that, that's essentially what a lot of people are doing, is just trading for someone who happen to have the items they need, because crafting yourself is essentially just not really a thing. It's just gambling. Um, I do think this is also giving people a very skewed idea of the game, because when people are playing in early access right now and they're playing in Trade League and just trading for all the items, they're not getting a very accurate picture of what the game really looks like and how bad the RNG is. But that's another conversation altogether. But I do recommend that if you've been playing nothing but Trade League, you probably try to play SSF at least once before you form your own opinions, because the game should be playable without having to excessively trade. And it is. I'm not saying it's unplayable, but as I said, like, it just comes down to just gambling harder and harder and harder. If you're playing SSF, it's not about, oh, I need to go to Delve to get my fossils. I need to put essence on my map to get my essences for another piece, and so on. It's just about pulling that slot machine lever over and over and over, regardless of whether it's picking up items off the ground or buying them from the vendor or whatnot, until you hopefully get what you want. And this is also why we have there's always been a bit of schism in PoE 1 that I think has been exacerbated over the years, and I think it's getting worse right now, where you kind of have two different very kinds of people. You have one kind which are, the gamble happy people, the people who, say they always buy their gear. They say, like, oh, I never use currency, versus the people who actually want to play the game and use the currency and craft things themselves. And generally, if you're the kind of person who's happy, just buying gear off trade and pulling that slot machine and lever, you're probably, a lot of these criticisms, you know, may not really apply to your point of view. But I'm definitely I'm definitely very much in the non-gambler camp, where I want to play the game, I want to farm currency, I want to craft my own gear. And as that kind of player, PoE 2 is very much going in the wrong direction, and not really a direction I particularly enjoy. Touching a bit more on GGG's overall philosophies with deterministic crafting and non-deterministic crafting. Uh, there's the whole harvest versus expedition mentality is the best way to explain it. Um, Harvest was probably the most deterministic league we ever had. It was absolutely nuts when it was released. It later got toned down and then got nerfed more and more and more. Whether it got nerfed too much, not enough, etc., or just right, is a whole other conversation and debate, which I'm not going to dive into right now. But I want to contrast it with Expedition, specifically with ROG and how ROG works in general. So Harvest was very much about understanding what mods were on the item, having a very coherent plan, doing the whole, giant 20-step plan in order to craft the item. And Expedition is essentially the complete opposite of that. ROG, which for those of you who never clued into it, essentially stands for Random Object Generator. Is essentially that, a random object generator. You pull the slot machine lever and hopefully you get lucky. You get options to modify an item, but they're pure RNG, and you very rarely get the options you want. And it's something that is useful at the start of the league, mainly because of his ability to upgrade all mods to higher tiers. But it's something which drops off severely in power. drops off severely in power as the league progresses. So GGG hates Harvest. GGG hates Harvest. We know they're terrified of Harvest. They're terrified of that deterministic power. We know that they think it's bad for the game. We have heard them say it publicly. We have heard many developers say it. I've heard it in private as well. They genuinely think that having players get gear too quickly is bad for the game, because they think that once players essentially finish their characters, they stop playing the game and they move on. Now, this is again when it comes down to like different types of players and how it applies to different people. Because personally, for me, this has not been true at all. The league that I spent the most amount of time playing by far was in fact Harvest League. There's been multiple leagues that I played for, you know, almost the full length, and they were almost all like, you know, heavy crafting leagues such as Dell. But Harvest, I played that league up until the minute the servers went down. I was literally still crafting and still playing the game and still mapping as the servers went down, which is something I had never done in any PoE league before and have not done in any PoE league since. I was playing it non-fucking stop, and the only reason, you know, the only breaks I took from it was because Command and Conquer Tiberian Dawn came out at the time, which was, you know, another game like I really enjoyed, and I still think it's a great game. Just wish it had more of a multiplayer scene, but you know, what can you expect for the game that old? But when I was able to get craft good items and create a strong character, I played the game more. But a lot of this ties back into another one of GGG's Achilles heels, and the one thing that I did think was going to be a big problem in PoE 2 before it launched, which was the overall skill balance, which is that skill balance in PoE 1 is generally really bad. But because so much power in PoE is in the items, you can make a bad skill good by throwing enough, you know, powerful items / currency at it. You could also take a good build and throw a lot of powerful items currency on it and make it ridiculous. But Harvest essentially enabled a lot of builds that weren't viable before, because, you know, they would require an obscene amount of gear in order to be put into a good state. So that definitely is, I think, an inextricable part of that, where if skill balance was better, maybe things would have been a bit better, but that has been a big issue with GGG forever, which is that they've never really been good at balancing skills. They nerf the top end quite a bit, you know, unless it's DD, of course, but they never really buff underpowered skills to the degree that they should, and they never really look heavily at how those skills perform while leveling either. So essentially they think that, you know, you finish items too quickly, people quit the league, and maybe this is true for a lot of people, but it essentially wasn't really true for me. When in leagues with more agency, with more crafting power, I found myself playing the game more than ever, and now that we are in PoE 2 and have the least amount of crafting power that we've, you know, pretty much ever had, you know, except since like the very start of PoE 1, but as I said, there was less power located in the items in PoE 1 than in PoE 2. It's kind of no surprise to me that this is not something that I particularly care for in terms of game design direction. But yeah, of course, Expedition is located in PoE 2. One thing that I think is a very key observation is that just about every mechanic they've included in PoE 2 is very, very heavy on the RNG. Especially on stacking RNG, and we can see this especially in the trials, but we'll talk about that in a moment. So, yeah, that's roughly covers it for RNG. There's, as I said, obviously there's more, but there's you know, I'm trying not to make this a 5-hour video, but at the rate we're going, it might actually be a 5-hour video. So I'm actually gonna break this up. Should I break it up? Or should I just do one long fucking video? Okay, I think we're gonna break it up into a couple videos here, because I'm looking at my list here, and I'm about a third way through it. So let's break it up in hour chunks. So yeah, end of this video. Check the next video for the rest. We covered the friction and the RNG, and we'll cover the rest in the other videos.